Hi, hello, and welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. Today, we're going to be exploring the very exciting concept of the ecological civilization. You might hark back to my recent episode exploring the question, is eco-socialism the answer? Today, I wanted to explore more in depth an example of eco-socialism in action to help us to understand the ways managing the balance between the environment, society, politics, and economics outside of the framework of sustainable development, which, if you didn't know, is a concept that more or less relies on the capitalist framework because it's predicated on growth. The purpose of this video is to explore and describe the concept of an eco-civilization and see it in action. It's not necessarily a video that endorses socialism. I'm not sold that a global transition to socialism can happen in a peaceful way, and from what I remember from my GCSE in geography, some examples of socialist civilization were bloody awful. There was war, there was famine, it was terrifying, and it didn't end well for a lot of countries. But I am curious about it as a concept. In case you weren't listening in history, socialism is a famously utopian ideal, with communism being its practical application. It proposes equality, balance through collectivization and central planning, which are all things that I think, in principle, are a very good idea. But I'm yet to see it translate into a practical reality that I can get behind. Maybe I've succumbed to Western propaganda, but I like my freedom and I'm fearful of the level of control over my destiny I would have to forfeit. And more importantly, the level of trust I'd have to put into the hands of a government to pull off the socialist dream. Given that the world is on the verge of an ecological disaster, I'm willing to park my fears and neuroses aside and at least be open to exploring what eco-socialism looks like in application. So let's jump in. History and context. The ecological civilization is in part a slogan used by the Chinese government to describe their integrating of environmentalism into government plans, and a universal and hypothetical concept that emphasises the need for major environmental and social reforms that are both long-term and systemic, and that these reforms are the final goal of a given society. The term was first used by Soviet Union environmental experts in 1984, and by 1998, the CCP began to shift its focus from regular developmentalism towards eco-developmentalism. By 2012, the goal of achieving an ecological civilization was imprinted into the constitution, becoming one of the country's main development goals and part of the 13th five-year plan. It initially focused on a rural development approach of ecology, productivity, and livability, but now we'll see there's a lot more focus on eco-cities and improving urban areas. In government. Now, why eco-socialism and not sustainable development? Under the 13th five-year plan, the goal of the CCP is to achieve sustainable development that is characteristically Chinese, appealing to Chinese philosophical values through environmental action. The PRC are drawing upon ancient Taoist beliefs about people living in harmony with nature, in contrast to other transitions across the world like the agricultural and industrial revolutions, where people have conquered nature. General Secretary Xi Jinping pointed out the ecological civilization is a significant achievement of human social progress. Humankind has experienced primitive civilization, agricultural civilization, and industrial civilization. The rise of the ecological civilization is the inevitable result of developing and transforming productivity in modern society. Now remember that China is a socialist country. Under socialism, central government is responsible for the planning and distribution of resources rather than the market under capitalism. It requires a lot more deliberate political and cultural involvement. There is a party accountable if plans don't take off. This is a contrast to sustainable development, where we might have policies and law in place, but ultimately we're leaving it to the market to decide. It means that social relations and nature turn into commodities, whose inherent worth is measured by the amount of money they can make. China's reputation. China does not have the greatest reputation in terms of its environmental stewardship. It is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, the largest source of marine debris, the worst perpetrators of unregulated fishing, and the world's largest consumer of trafficked wildlife and timber products, according to the US Department of State. But their attitude towards the environment might not be any worse than the US's, who equally have a reputation for trying to excuse themselves from international environmental agreements. In fact, I found a number of references to successful environmental campaigns in China that I want to explore. let's look at what the goals are. It's probably what you would expect. We've got a technological innovation, spatial planning and development, and to give some specific examples, there was a policy to reduce airside pollution in 2013, bringing with it cleaner energy sources. There was a Water and Soil Pollution Act in 2015 to reduce fertilisers and pesticides. There's laws about the circular economy and, of course, carbon. China wants to peak its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 and expand its forest stocks by 6 billion cubic metres. So let's take a look at two initiatives. The first is forest conservation. And first, let me hit you with some facts about deforestation in China. China has 211 million hectares of tree cover. It is the fifth country in the world with the most trees in it. By 2020, the total forest cover in China has increased from 8.6% to 23%, thanks to reforestation programs throughout the 1950s and 70s, aiming to address soil erosion caused by the Chinese Civil War. According to Global Forest Watch, the total area of primary forest in China has declined by 4.5% between 2000 and 2020. Primary forests are important, not only as carbon sinks, but also in terms of diversity, which is a service man-made plantations cannot contribute. So whilst forest cover is going up, diversity could be going down. They have introduced stricter measures within its borders. It's thought that China is responsible for 60% of the volume of illegal imports of wood, coming from countries like Papua New Guinea, Nigeria, and Equatorial Guinea. It is one of the most lucrative criminal markets in the world, representing 30% of the overall market of wood products. The Great Cuttings. China has long used deforestation as a tool to boost its economy, building houses, railroads, and dams. The first era of the Great Cuttings occurred during Mao's Great Leap Forward, between 1958 and 62. The government introduced mandatory agricultural collectivization and created steel furnaces in the backyards across the country. The local environment was stripped of trees to feed the industrialization effort, and ultimately, this shift away from agricultural work led to severe famine and the collapse of the economy in 1961. There were two more Great Cuttings from 66 to 88. In an attempt to establish independence after China's split from the Soviet Union and the US, and later under Deng Xiaoping, who reintroduced privatization and relaxed policies. Between 1981 and 85, deforestation reached 195 million cubic metres as local people went to town on their forests to build their own homes. The final Great Cutting came in the 1990s in a nationwide initiative to establish a new market economy. Private companies cleared swathes of the forest mountains in Sichuan and Xinjiang. This going to town on forests came to a crashing halt in 1998. Without these ancient woodlands to soak up the rain, these now bare mountains became a slippery slope for huge downpours of rain across south and central China, resulting in massive flooding across the Yangtze River, flooding the homes and farmlands of millions of people. So on to our case study. This is very much based on a paper called Eco-Socialism and the Political Ecology of Forest Conservation in the Greater Kangjigan Range, China. This paper looks at the role of state-owned forestry enterprises in driving China's conservation efforts as an eco-socialist initiative and an approach to forest conservation. State-owned enterprises are an important mechanism under China's communism. Under Mao, SOEs were organised into work units called danwei, which was the mainstream of social identity in Chinese socialist cities. It provided employment and housing, meal provisions and bathhouses, childcare, early schooling, medical treatment, political study, party membership, marriage and divorce, policing and security. This created a strong dependency between their workers and their work units. The SOEs were the fundamental to socialist state power. These forestry SOEs were set up during the Maoist era and have been reorganised under the National Forest Conservation Programme. In forestry-dependent communities, these forestry enterprises hold a lot of social, economic and political currency and have recently undergone a restructuring away from the dependency on logging and towards conservation. Up there with the world's largest forest conservation programs, China has been a dominant contributor to global greening and accounts for 25% of global net increase in leaf area. 42% of this comes from forests since 2000. The Greater Kangaragan Range is a mountain range in northeast China near Manchuria, which spans 12,000 kilometers from northwest to southwest. It is home to China's largest virgin forests. These are forests that have never been logged and forms part of the coniferous forest of northern Eurasia. Historically, the area was sparsely populated because it's very remote, and also due to a policy known as the Willow Palisade, which was to protect Manchuria from being settled by the Han Chinese. Since the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the area has succumbed to the demands of timber and farmland and has undergone exploitation. In recent times, the government has started to take an environmental protection more seriously and thus has transformed the region into an area of forest conservation under the National Forest Conservation Programme. The NFCP had humble beginnings. It began in 1998 as a policy to manage flooding in the area through the control of deforestation. The NFCP has created protected areas to prevent logging and hunting, which are illegal, and controls commercial logging in natural forests. Through this policy, logging quotas have been reduced over time until 2014, when they were removed altogether in northeast China and removed nationwide by 2016. Through this policy, in the last 20 years, natural forest stock volume has increased by around 50%, from 9.7 billion metres squared to 13.67 billion metres squared. So the conservation benefits are very clear. Economically, it's located in remote areas where local opportunities are sparse. Most residents can only work for a forestry enterprise or a related industry. Those forestry enterprises are the main governing body of the region and are very much integrated with the local government. These don't revolve around making profit, but the benefit of the community, and remain in charge of the provision of housing, hospitals, and education. Whilst in the long term, the social benefits for moving towards an economy based on conservation seem clear, the transition hasn't been smooth for many who have found themselves laid off with no work. Now on to case study number 2, which is the Yangtze River Economic Belt Initiative. This is a significant development initiative in China. The Yangtze River is the longest river in China and it is the third longest in the world. The Yangtze River Basin covers 1/5 of China's area and has played an incredible role in the country's history and development. It generates 20% of the country's GDP and includes 11 provinces like Shanghai, Sichuan, and Jiangsu. New urbanisation, high-quality development, and the co-building of the Belt and Road Initiative are central to the Yangtze River Economic Belt Initiative, as well as rural revitalisation, which aims to increase the proportion of ecosystem service function, biodiversity protection, with no less than 800,000 square kilometres of land preserved for ecological protection. As an example, Shanghai is leading the development of green finance and development hubs. The Shanghai 2035 Master Plan focuses on urban development. Key goals include optimising land use, enhancing green spaces, and promoting eco-friendly infrastructure. The Lingang New City has been developed as an eco-city, integrating green building practices, renewable energy, and green spaces that enhance biodiversity. There's the Million Trees project to plant trees across the city to improve air quality and provide shade. There's also rainwater management, wastewater treatment, and the cleaning up of the Hangpu trajectory. Chongqing is focused on reducing industrial emissions and improving waste management. There are extensive green and ecological parks in the plan. Western Chongqing has become a science city, designed as an innovation hub to promote green technologies to create a model ecological urban planning. There's also hydropower projects in the pipeline to help the city capitalise on the Yangtze River. There are also electric buses, bike sharing systems, and environmental education programs. Other notable projects in China include its national carbon market and the Belt and Road Initiative, which the Yangtze River Economic Belt kind of feeds into. The Belt and Road Initiative is a global development strategy which is adopted by the Chinese government. It aims to revive the ancient Silk Roads, connecting China to Europe via Central Asia, the Middle East and Russia. But the carbon market and the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, are examples for another time. That brings us to the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you next time.